Imagine waiting 2 weeks to know if you got a like or not, or a thumbs up. In the decades before the internet, people made comics, and we reached out to each other. What was it like? This is the Sequential Artists Workshop, and these are the 90s mini comics oral history archives. Come join us as we take a longer look at those analog days when communication was a lot slower, maybe more deliberate, maybe more reckless. Who knows? It was just different. Join us as we take a look and really notice how much things have changed. Come join us on the socials. Sometimes it's Comics Workshop, sometimes it's Saw Comics. Either way, come check us out and welcome.
All right. Hi, everyone. This is our next episode in our series of the 90s or mini comics oral history archives. Today we are talking with Leela Corman. So we will go ahead and get right on into our introduction. Thank you so much for joining us. Can you please say your name, the date, and where you are recording from?
My name is Leela Corman. The date is August. Oh my God, what date is it? It's August 16th, 2024. And I am in Providence, Rhode Island.
Awesome. And what are some comics publications that you created or were a part of in the pre-internet era?
In the pre-internet era, I self-published 3 issues of a mini comic called Flim Flam and a couple of other one-offs, one called Valentine. Then there's a very significant portion of my early career that is kind of like the beginning of the internet. So I guess I won't talk about that stuff, but Flim Flam was the main one.
Nice.
Oh, and I also, the first person who ever published me, now that I'm thinking about it, outside of the self-publishing context was Jeff Taylor, who had a magazine called Don't Shoot, It's Only Comics. And he had me do the cover of one of them, and he published some of my first earliest attempts at making comics.
Nice. That's awesome. And what are some locations you worked from in the 80s or 90s?
Well, in the 80s, I was a child and a teenager, so I was not making comics. I was finding them and reading them. In the 90s, when I started making Flim Flam, I was living in an amazing illegal apartment in downtown Boston on Boylston Street, that some people call the Rock House, which I know sounds really cheesy, but there was a practice space in the basement, and almost everybody who lived there was in a rock band. I was like one of the only ones who really wasn't. And it was a really fertile time in Boston for art and music because it was so cheap to live there. This place was across the street from the Boylston Street T stop. So if anyone is familiar with Boston, you'll know where I'm talking about. I'm still learning all kinds of crazy stuff about that building. Like apparently there was like a secret theater beneath that and a couple of other buildings that might have been sealed off when I lived there. There is all sorts of vaudeville history in that neighborhood, and some of the old timers in the neighborhood, one of whom is still there, were like old vaudeville performers who ran businesses in the area. But I lived on the 6th floor. It was a 7th floor building. The elevator was usually broken, so it was a de facto walk up. And my drafting table was right next to the window that overlooked Boylston Street. So I would go wait tables, and then I would go home, and I would sit at my desk, and I would look out the window, and I would draw comics and just kind of like listen to the street life. It was pretty amazing. It
Yeah,
was a great experience.
that sounds awesome. That sounds like a great kind of environment for an artist.
It was, and nothing really compared to that for a long time. We got evicted from that place eventually when rent control was voted out and people were being more strict about illegal apartments. So I ended up kind of bouncing around me and my drafting table and my comics. But it was always, after that, it was always in my bedroom, once in a while in the living room until, in Boston and in New York, until we moved to Florida. But that's getting into the internet age, so.
Nice. All right. Well, how would you describe your comics work?
Back then,
Yeah.
or
Or now,
so
or maybe how that description might have changed over time.
well, so back then, there weren't education programs for comics like there are now. So There was no SAW, there was no CCS, there were no optional classes in art school. I was kind of in and out of mass art at that point, and they were actually pretty hostile to making comics. If you wanted to make comics, if you wanted to talk about them, you could get kicked out of class. Like people were not into it. So, teachers were not, they were not interested in it as an art form. And we were all, anyone who did comics or was interested in reading them or talking about them was kind of on the defensive about
Mhm.
it. And for people like me who wanted to make art comics, there were no educational programs. They really only existed if you wanted to make superhero comics. So we all taught ourselves, and I think that this is really evident in our generation of cartoonists. I don't have a grand unified theory of this, but I think a lot of the underground cartoonists, the original underground cartoonists in the 60s and 70s were looking at the comics they'd grown up reading, newspaper strips and romance comics and war comics and stuff like that, EC, Mad, and we were looking at some of that stuff too, but I think we were also looking at the undergrounds, and we were looking at the 80s post-underground. I was reading Raw a lot.
Mhm.
This kind of burst of creativity and flowering of art comics in the 90s, really the 80s and 90s. And all that stuff was there. It was readily available. I would go to Million Year Picnic in Harvard Square in Cambridge, and
Mhm.
with my tips money from waiting tables in a diner, I would buy whatever comics I could. And so I learned a lot by reading them. And then when I wanted to make them, I was just kind of making comics in the way that felt, it's hard to describe. I had to kind of figure out how to make them on my own. So,
Mhm.
like I said, I think that is how a lot of Gen X cartoonists, and I would almost venture to say, especially women, um, cartoonists taught ourselves. But I think that's also true of other genders too. I think it's sort of an all gender thing. Um, so maybe that gendering it is wrong. It was just a time when we were really experimenting a lot, and we didn't have Instagram or really like very, very easy networks immediately to hand at our fingertips. What we had were other people's mini comics and other people's small press comics. I also had previously had a classical training in figure drawing and figure painting. So I was coming in with that, and I had to completely undo all of that to make comics. It was very humbling.
Yeah, that's really interesting. All right. Cool. How would then let's move on to the comics production aspect. Can you tell us how you made your comics and what tools you used?
So that was another aspect of trial and error and kind of having to teach myself, because there was no one I could go to and say, hey, what are the tools of a cartoonist? I had to kind of figure it out on my own. And it turned out a lot of us were figuring it out on our own and coming to the same conclusion. Um, no one told me to buy a 12-inch stapler. I figured out I had to do that at some point. Um, I think the first comic I drew, for some reason, I drew it on tracing paper that I had taped to a piece of Bristol board or maybe illustration board, and I don't know why I did that. Um, Maybe I thought I was going to draw under it. I don't know, but I think I figured out pretty quickly that Bristol board was the appropriate medium
Mhm.
after trying a few different kinds of paper. Um, And I figured out also pretty quickly what kind of ink I liked. I already really liked working with a brush and ink in other contexts, like in figure drawing and just kind of art making in general. So with some more trial and error, I found that I liked working with a number 2 round, and that turned out to be kind of an industry standard also. Um, it's funny that it's funny that I arrived at that, through sort of fumbling towards it.
Yeah.
But I became very specific in the materials I used. So 0.7 mechanical pencil, a Mars plastic eraser. Don't ever use anything but a Mars plastic. Don't use the other white plastic ones. They will rip your work apart.
Hmm.
I hold to this today. Bristol board, an 18-inch cork-backed ruler, and a 12-inch stapler. That
Awesome.
was when I was oh, and liquid sumi ink, Yasutomo black. That was when I was working in ink. I work in watercolor now, but back in those days, for reproduction purposes too, you really couldn't work in color. Color Xeroxes and color printing were really expensive and difficult to deal with.
Yeah. Awesome. So can you tell us then how you would ready your comics for print?
Uh, well, I would have a big stack of them. I would bring them to Kinko's on Boylston Street in Boston, where this guy Rich Mackin worked. And Rich, if you're listening, hey, Rich was amazing. He was a zine maker and prankster and all around awesome guy who really knew how to produce a zine off of a Xerox machine. So I knew the Kinko's he worked at, and I would bring it to him, and I would ask him to be the guy who did it. It didn't hurt that there was this really cute guy who worked at that same Kinko's who I never exchanged one word with, but he was always there, and I was always like, "Who is that guy with Mickey Sudden hair? He's really cute." But that's how I would prep them for print. I would bring a big stack, and I would say, I want these digest size. This is the cover. This is the front cover. This is the back. This is the inside. I'm trying to remember if I would paginate the originals. Probably. I don't remember what the machine setup was because that stuff was out of my hands.
Yeah.
I've actually never been good at print setup. I'm terrible at it to this day.
Well, that might add to like the quality and uniqueness of the work though.
How do you figure that?
I don't know, just maybe they're all a little bit different.
Maybe, I mean, I think it's more, the measurements were always a little off. It's easier now that I'm working with a book publisher because they know exactly what dimensions to tell me to work with.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So do you remember how many you printed of your first comic and maybe how that's changed over time?
God, I wish I could remember. I remember that I charged $1 for them, and God, I don't think I made 100 copies of it. I'm sorry, I don't remember the print
Oh,
run.
it's fine. Do you know like over time how many you would regularly end up printing?
No, I really don't remember that.
Hmm. All right, no worries.
And it would sort of depend too, because, I didn't know about SPX or things like that when I first started making mini comics, which would have probably been in 1995, 96.
Mhm.
Um, I wasn't connected with the comics world yet. That first issue of Flim Flam was the thing that I used to kind of as my connector. I mailed that to a few artists whose work I admired, and I went to Millionaire Picnic with a few copies of it, and they bought, I think, they did what they usually do. They bought 5 or 10,
Mhm.
put it on the mini comics rack.
So this actually moves us on to our noticing and awareness section. Can you tell us when you first saw evidence of people making their own comics?
Yeah, very specifically, I was at Millionaire Picnic, probably buying Love and Rockets, and I looked down, and to my left there was a rack of mini comics, and the first one I noticed was Terrifying Steamboat Stories by Matt Madden.
Mhm.
And I don't know what it was about that mini, but it just kind of suddenly became noticeable to me. And because I was already really into zines, I was like a underground music, underground literature person. So zines were already part of my media diet. Um, that was the first time I saw that you could make a comic that was a zine, basically.
Mhm.
Uh, and I remember thinking, oh, I could do that. And what was really important to me about it was that it felt like a really democratic art form. I
Mhm.
was pretty disenchanted with art school, and I didn't understand what I was supposed to do with my art career-wise. The art world looked really demoralizing to me.
Mhm.
I was also, I was young, so I was very like dogmatic and rigid about that kind of thing too, in ways that I wouldn't be now.
Mhm.
There's a lot about the art world now that I think as an adult artist, I'm comfortable with and I can deal with. But at the time, I was like, I don't even understand what this is. And I had a whole ideological thing about the gallery versus the mini comic
Mhm.
that I think, I would dispense with now. but it was very important to me at the time. And the democracy of and accessibility of comics is still very important to me.
Yeah.
I loved at the time that you could make something, run off 100 copies of something, charge $1 for it, and a person could have it in their back pocket for
Yeah.
$1 or $2.
Yeah. That's awesome. All right. Then can you tell us a story of getting a comic that maybe surprised or inspired you?
Mm, where would I even start? God, I mean, early on, before I ever thought to make comics myself, except in a sort of hopeful way, Raw.
Hmm.
Raw dropped into my life when I was 17 and detonated like a bomb. It was like my ticket to the future.
Yeah.
That and the music I was listening to at the time, like 80s era Sonic Youth, basically.
Hmm.
It was like somebody handed me the blueprint for what my future was going to be. Um, and then, I mean, really almost every single underground or post-underground comic that I found was like that. I mean, there were the comics that made me just feel this intense sense of longing, like Raw and Love and Rockets, like unattainable, you know?
Hmm.
And then I remember it's funny what felt like the ones that unlocked my own sense of access are really unlikely ones. There was a period where I was dating this guy who had he had a lot of comics. He was always buying comics, and he had a whole bunch of J.R. Williams comics, if you remember those. Oh God,
Hmm.
I'm blanking on the title of the series. It was a floppy. One of the characters was this sort of weird humanoid, but sort of toad-headed guy named Milt the Mutation, and there was this very, very sketchbooky, rudimentary one pager of Milt the Mutation. I think just going through his day, or maybe like a sequence of him driving a car or something. And it was so sketched out and raw. And I thought, oh, yeah, I could totally do that.
Yeah.
Then one of the really big things also, and this is kind of ironic because I had previously said that mass art was very hostile to the making of comics, which is true, but
Hmm.
their gallery also hosted a traveling show called Comic Power.
Oh.
Was it called Comic Power? I think so. We could look it up because it was in the mid late 90s at Massachusetts College of Art. It'll be in their records.
Uh-huh.
That was like a 300-year survey of American comics. So colonial era, Condé Nast, into newspaper strips and underground and post-underground up to the minute. Like Jaime Hernandez and Art Spiegelman were in that show. And I think Linda Barry's work was in it. But the thing that really, really pushed it over the edge for me and told me, oh, right, I can absolutely be one of the people that makes these was that show, because that was the first time I saw originals. And that was where I saw all the imperfections. I saw blue pencil, I saw fingerprints, I saw that it looked like Art Spiegelman used a whiteout pen to
Hmm.
make snow in Mouse, a snowfall. I'm not sure if that's what he was using, but it sure looked like that.
Hmm.
Um, I saw that one big area of spot blacks on a Jaime Hernandez page was streaky. It
Hmm.
looked fine and it reproduced great, but just to see that a human hand made them.
Yeah.
And that's when I started drawing comics.
Yeah. That's really cool.
It was such a good show. I want to
Yeah.
find a record of it now.
All right. Did you ever read an issue of Fact Sheet 5?
Oh, hell yeah. And when Flim Flam got listed in Fact Sheet 5, that was like, okay, I've arrived.
Hmm. Did you ever order a comic or write to someone as a result of seeing it?
That I'm not sure about.
Yeah.
That I don't know.
Mm. But you said that Flim Flam got featured in it?
Got listed, you know,
Yeah.
one of
Nice.
the little capsule things that they did.
Yeah.
That
Nice.
was a big deal at the time.
Hmm. All right. Well, that brings us to the community section. Can you tell us a story of how you met your closest friend or peer in comics?
Well, I mean, closest friend or peer in comics might be the guy I married, Tom Hart. But I mean, so many other people. I would say my closest friends who are not my husband,
Hmm.
the people that I don't have children with.
Hmm.
Um, I met probably a few years in the well, once the internet was already firmly in place.
Hmm.
Not that those things are necessarily connected, but some of them were. It's funny, I was just having dinner with Lauren Weinstein last night and some other people and remembering how I met her. So I remember meeting her at Enid's, which is a bar in Brooklyn
Hmm.
that was named for Enid Coleslaw from Ghost World, actually. I don't know if Enid's is still around, but that place was like a Williamsburg, it was on the border of Williamsburg and Greenpoint, and it was a staple of a place. And I distinctly remember even where I was standing when Lauren gave me her Mindspring email address.
Uh-huh.
But that's the internet. So pre-internet, um, I would hang out sometimes with the don't shoot people.
Hmm.
Jeff in particular is a great guy and is now a zookeeper in Boston and an awesome animal advocate and animal person.
Hmm.
Um, he gave me and my daughter an awesome tour of the Franklin Park Zoo. We got to hang out at gorilla lunchtime because of Jeff. So there's a friend I made in comics who's still
Yeah.
around. I don't, that was the first time I'd seen him in years, but the internet lets you keep tabs on people.
Yeah.
Tom, probably, I would say.
Hmm. Nice. And can you tell a story how you met?
Well, it was an event that Tom Devlin had set up called the Cambridge Comic Circus. And the idea was to have cartoonists doing non-comics things,
Hmm.
so mostly performance. And it was completely all over the place. Like Sam Henderson did a slideshow reading of the comic of his where an ass in a box falls from the sky. It's,
Hmm.
uh, Sam Henderson is also that was the first time I'd ever met a lot of these people for the first, like Sam Henderson, Jessica Abel, Matt Madden, a lot of those people were there that night. And Sam has sort of faded into obscurity unfairly, I think. He's really funny and he should totally be part of this project if he's not already.
Uh-huh.
Because he was making his mini comic Magic Whistle for years before the internet. It was great. So, God, there was this guy who was part of the noise rock scene, um, and was friends with Ron Rigi.
Hmm.
Um, but this guy was very intimidating to me. He's actually a very nice guy, but at the time I found him extremely intimidating. And he did this performance with Ron Rigi where if I remember right, at least one of them was wearing a bumblebee costume, possibly both of them.
Hmm.
Very unintimidating, a grown man in a bumblebee costume.
Uh-huh.
Tom performed Beckett's play Crap's Last Tape, which is a one-person play with a sock puppet. Um, that I still have that sock puppet somewhere. He didn't even glue a googly eye to it. He drew an eye on a piece of paper, cut it out, and taped it to the sock. And it was like an old grayish, kind of washed out braid sock.
Hmm.
Um, I thought it was kind of ingenious. Like to see
Uh-huh.
somebody doing a Beckett play with a sock puppet, I thought was totally brilliant. Tom to this day I don't think he thinks very highly of it, but I thought it was great. That's just such a cool idea. Like who does that? Only Tom. It's really cool. I got up on stage at intermission. Somebody asked for somebody was like, "Hey, someone come up here and tell a joke." And so I asked for a volunteer to tell this joke that it's called the chicken joke, and I can't do it without another person present. It's extremely stupid. I
Hmm.
haven't told it in years because I have stopped being a person who tells jokes, but um, I liked to joke in the past that I'd been trying to impress boys with it since I was in high school.
Hmm.
Tom hopped up on stage and was my volunteer. And then
Oh,
we spent all night talking, and then we ended up going on a date the next day.
nice. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was really nice.
Cool. All right. Well, can you tell us about the first show or con situation where there were other people doing what you did? Was it that show you were mentioning that?
Yeah, but I sort of don't really count that
Hmm.
exactly because that was it was certainly a community event, but the first con I went to was SPX probably in 1999.
Nice.
Yeah, maybe 98, one of those years.
Yeah. Awesome. Um, can you tell us when you felt the most connected in the community or the least connected or both?
I would say I tend to feel very connected most of the time these days. Um, Especially because I have a really tight-knit group of of comics women that I've been
Mhm.
friends with for years, that I'm really, they're like my sisters.
Mhm.
Megan Kelso, Vanessa Davis, Mari Naomi, Laura Park, a few other people, just like people that I care about, I trust, like we could talk about anything. And there's a lot of other people that I'm not naming in that list too. I would say though, I felt very disconnected from comics after I put out my second book, Subway series.
Mhm.
And I think it's because I made the mistake of reading some of the reviews, and some of them were just like written by dudes, and they were like,
Mhm.
well, this isn't my experience, so I hate it.
Uh-huh.
Seriously, like that was the general take on Subway series.
Yeah.
And I think that book has a lot of problems, but I was really young and sensitive, and I kind of retreated and was
Mhm.
like, fuck comics. Comics are a shitty place to be. I don't want to be there. And at
Mhm.
the same time, I was continuing to make them, and I had tons of friends in that world and still do. Um, I think though, for the most part, comics is very welcoming. And so I've had many experiences of feeling like I've been welcomed with open arms. I guess one that I could really flag was when we moved back to New York in 2000, and I started going to Bob Sikoriak's carousel events. I knew of Bob because of my love of Raw comics. He was in some of the original Raws. And I had actually met him when I was a teenager in a really different context. I was interning at a performance art space, and he was friends with one of the people who worked there. And he would come in, and somebody at one point was like, oh yeah, that guy draws the Bazooka Joe comic and he draws for Raw. And I was like, oh wow. Oh, it's that guy. Like I put two and two together. I was like, oh my God. So years later, when I moved back to New York and I started going to his events, when he invited me to participate in one, that's when I really felt like, oh, I've arrived in a good way. Like I felt very, very welcome.
Yeah.
Another time was the first time I met the cartoonist Kaz.
Mhm.
Uh, I walked in late to the cartoonist hangout. Everybody was at a big table in the back of some bar in Chelsea, and I sat down and I was talking to somebody else, and I was like very like many people away from Kaz. All of a sudden, I hear my name, and I look over, and Kaz says, "Hey, Leela, who was that French guy Lisa Suckdog was married to?" And I was like, "Oh, Jean-Louis Coste." And then years later, I was like, "Hey, Kaz, how did you know that I would know the answer to that?" And he was like, "I don't know, I could just tell." So I'm a huge Lisa Suckdog fan. Lisa Carver is the name that it's her actual name, and the name that she publishes her writing under. She was also under the name Lisa Suckdog, a punk performance artist. And that particular husband, Jean-Louis Coste, um, was in her performance piece the only time I ever saw them, which was at CBGB's in the 90s. And he pulled me up on stage, actually. Like in the way that happened at a Suck Dog show, he sort of performatively groped me in a way that I was not mad about
Mhm.
because it was part of the Suck Dog show.
Mhm.
Uh, but I jumped off stage.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to really continue with this, but this is cool.
Yeah.
But so I thought it was really funny that was like, I've never met this cartoonist before whose work I've loved for years, and this is the thing he asks me, and it's so niche.
Uh-huh. Well, thank goodness you knew.
It's like the subculture of a subculture of a subculture.
Uh-huh. Awesome. All right. Well, who would you say were slash are your most significant peers in comics? Significant in the sense of how they impacted you and your work.
Peers, not influences.
Mhm.
Although some do cross that territory. Vanessa Davis, Lauren Weinstein, Nick Bertozzi, Tom Hart for sure. Um, Megan Kelso. I'm trying to think of people who are my generation really, because I think that I'm defining peers in that way. Jason Little. But there's a lot of people both older and younger than me that I consider significant peers as well. But in those cases, especially with some of the older ones, I would say they're more like trailblazers and influencers.
Mhm.
I would say that group
Nice.
primarily.
All right.
I'm sure I'm forgetting some
Did you ever
significant people.
do collaborations or draw jams with them?
Yeah, probably.
Nice. And how would you say that they affected your own work?
Well, I think Vanessa was a big influence on my work because her work is so fearless. She
Hmm.
draws so fearlessly. And when I first saw it, it had a big influence on me in that I immediately wanted to be as fearless as her.
Hmm.
Um, in hard professional terms, she was a big influence in that one day I was complaining to her that this Jewish magazine that I illustrated for sometimes wanted me to pitch them a bunch of Jewish specific comics ideas. And I was like, I don't have any, I don't know what to do. And she was like, Leela, the last 5 stories you told me are totally pitch worthy. And that's how I ended up doing a bunch of pieces for this one publication. I have Vanessa to thank for putting me on that path. Oh, I would also say Ariel Bordeaux. We came up at the same time. I was reading her mini comics and her anthology contributions back then. And then she's the person who ended up getting me hired at Rhode Island School of Design, where I'm now a full-time faculty member.
Nice.
Yeah, so I really owe Ariel a lot. Lauren McCubbin as well, who introduced me to her agent.
Hmm.
I was telling her the idea for Untersaken, and she stopped me and she said, "Who are you going to pitch this to?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know, I guess just like the usual kind of big underground publishers, big, indie presses." And she was like, "They're not going to pay you properly. And this is a big deal of a project. You need to get paid well. I'm going to introduce you to my agent."
Nice.
Yeah. I have found that comics is very supportive, and I try to pay that forward as much
Yeah,
as possible.
that's really cool.
Oh, I would also, I'm sorry, I'm still thinking of the peer question. Craig Thompson,
Hmm.
although I mean, his drawing skills are so like astronomical, it's hard. I never thought of myself as his peer. But in terms of being kind of the same generation and making mini comics around the same time, for sure.
Nice. All right. Well, that'll bring us into our distribution section. Can you tell us how you traded or sold your comics?
Yeah, well, like I said, I sold some to Millionaire Picnic. I'm trying to remember. I don't who did I have any distribution for Flim Flam? That I really don't remember, honestly. I think if I'm really racking my brain. I'm guessing some smaller comic stores around the country maybe ordered a few copies here and there. People would order them by mail because they would see it somewhere and then they would see the mailing address to order more from.
Hmm.
Um, gosh. And then I would sell them. I would sell them at cons. Very quickly though, I kind of exited the mini comics world and went into the publishing world because I won a Xeric grant in 1999.
Hmm.
Uh, so so then I was kind of in a broader distribution network at that point.
Yeah, that's cool. Can you tell us about some of the other comics that you remember from that time?
Well, are we talking only mini comics or any comic?
Um, either, whatever comes to mind first.
Dame Darcy's Meat Cake,
Hmm.
and of course Love and Rockets. I mean, I was mainlining that. Um, Julie Doucet's Dirty Plot, huge deal. Chester Brown, Jordan Crane
Uh-huh.
came on the scene around that same time, making really gorgeous comics. And he lived in Boston at the same time as we did, so we hang out sometimes. He's amazing, and he's still making really beautiful work. I hope you talk to him for this series.
Yeah.
He's important too.
Mhm.
Um, Nick Bertozzi, like I said, I mean, he and I were coming up at the same time, and actually, I think we won Xeric grants in the same cycle, if I remember correctly.
Mhm.
It's funny how wobbly memory is.
Uh-huh.
Like, you've done enough work, you start to not be able to place certain things that you thought you would think you could remember. Um, but I mean, like, okay, so when I was training my eye and hand, when I was reading a lot of comics, like really, really studying the art form closely, it was the comics I just mentioned, and also Twisted Sisters, all of the Twisted Sisters anthologies.
Yeah. Awesome. What about those kind of stuck with you that like they're what comes to mind now?
Oh, just the absolute, again, I'll say it, fearlessness,
Mhm.
especially Phoebe Gleckner was a huge influence.
Hmm.
I remember reading her work and a couple of other people and thinking, wow, you really can say and do anything in this art form. Debbie Drexler, also, if you recall her work,
Hmm.
um, it really felt like people were pushing the boundaries of what you could include in a comic visually and narratively.
Hmm.
And that was really exciting.
Yeah.
It also was very cross-disciplinary, you know? I mean, there were painters making comics, sculptors, architects. Phoebe comes from a medical illustration background, and that's really evident in a lot of her work,
Hmm.
in its meticulousness and its visceral quality. Um, and then when I started seeing French comics too, that was a huge deal. I mean, that was another like lightning bolt hit for a lot of us.
Uh-huh.
It was wild to see how comics were being made in Europe.
Yeah. Did you ever visit like European festivals like Angoulême?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I went to Angoulême every year for a few years in a row. Um, and then there was a long break where I didn't go. I went in 2013 when I was pregnant with my daughter, and I'm going back this year.
Oh, nice.
But I mean, yeah, we started going to Angoulême in, I think, 1999 or so because Tom had a French publisher.
Hmm.
And I actually got to table with this wonderful guy, Alban Rotenstrauch, who I need to get back in touch with actually. 'Cause I owe him too. Really sweet guy, who he published some small press anthologies,
Hmm.
and he let me, he gave me a part in, he put my work in, and so I would table it at his table. It was really awesome.
Yeah.
And he and my French translator, Jean-Paul Jeanquin, are the people who introduced me to my French publisher, Ça et là.
Hmm. Nice. Did you ever feel connected to a particular store or venue that supported you in your community?
Well, I worked at Millionaire Picnic for a while.
Hmm.
I mean, that's a type of connection.
Yeah.
Certainly. Um, you know, supported by them, supported by Tony, certainly.
Mhm.
Tony's a lovely person and great cheerleader of all of us. Trying to think anybody else. I mean, at the time, I would say Millionaire Picnic, but once we moved back to New York, not really. No.
Mhm. All right. Um, were you ever part of any kind of distribution collective like Puppy Toss, or did you submit
No,
to small
no, I never
distributors?
was. No.
Mm. All right.
I'm not sure
Um,
those existed on the East Coast.
yeah.
I could be wrong, but I don't recall ever coming across any. I think for whatever reason, maybe it's in the water. There was more of that in the Midwest and on the West Coast.
Uh-huh. Yeah. All right. Well, that'll bring us to our wrap-up section. Can you tell me what you miss about that time?
Hmm, not much, to be quite honest with you. Um, I really like being an older, more established artist.
Yeah.
I like my facility with making comics. I like my position in the field, my ability to teach people and share the wealth of all that I've been given as an artist.
Hmm.
I really appreciate my older, wiser brain and body. I don't think I would trade any of that in for being young again.
Hmm.
Um, I don't think that I've lost any of my experimental quality in my work. I think if anything, I've gained it back over the years. Um, no, there's nothing I really miss. I mean, I'm really racking my brain. You know, the only thing I miss about that time period more broadly is cheap rent.
Yeah.
And but this is really meaningful because my generation are the last generation who had access to cheap rent in big cities.
Hmm.
Millennials did not get that, and anyone younger. How old are you?
23.
Okay, it's it really sucks.
Yeah.
So, like, as I don't have to tell you, um, a little bit of background about that, and please understand, this is not like me being an expert on urban development and housing policy.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, just my own observations, rent control was voted out in the state of Massachusetts in the mid-90s.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden there was this feeding frenzy. The rents got really high. They started to go to New York levels without any New York amenities,
Mm-hmm.
mind you. And this was not something that my generation enacted. This was the older generation,
Mm-hmm.
politicians who did it. It really, really sucked for everybody. And since then, cities have become unmanageably expensive. It
Mm-hmm.
started with big cities, being handed off to developers, but I think it's everywhere now. I think it's in small cities.
Yeah.
Where do you?
I'm here in Gainesville, Florida, and when I'm not here, I'm in Savannah, Georgia, so I see it in both places.
I was gonna say, like, when I go back to Gainesville, I can see it. I
Yeah.
see the encroachment. I
Mm-hmm.
think it's actually part of something global. It isn't only local or even national. But it's really insidious. And I feel like we all just got handed over to the greediest elements in society.
Mm-hmm.
But at least for my generation, that didn't happen until we were in our mid to late 20s.
Yeah.
That didn't start until then. For you guys, I feel really awful for you guys because I don't know, and I don't mean to sound doom and gloom. I think people make cultural scenes wherever they are,
Mm-hmm.
whenever they are, but I don't know how a really vibrant cultural scene and artistic and musical scene can be sustained in a place where people have to struggle so hard to get by.
Mm-hmm. I
Like
think the
you,
art that comes out of it is just different because of the circumstances.
yeah, you know what? That's really interesting. How would you characterize the art that comes out of that?
I think there is a lot of there's you can definitely see like on the surface a lot of doom and gloom kind of levels, but I think there's also a desire for escapism in a lot of work. I think absurdism is really coming back in with younger generations, or at least from my peers and what I'm seeing and creating. Um, so maybe it's a means of like coping with it or a means to make sense of it.
I am so happy to hear your perspective on it because that makes a lot of sense to me, and it's not something that I would have been able to think of. I wouldn't have been able to see. That makes so much sense. Whereas I think in my generation there was a lot of I mean we inherited a tradition. We inherited a an ethos of being very confrontational
Hmm.
that arises from 70s and 80s underground art, especially feminist and punk art and
Hmm.
cultural production. That was a huge part, I think, of the underground comics that we were making in the 90s, that we were reading and then that we were starting to make.
Yeah.
Um, And I think I get the sense that in younger generations, they don't necessarily always want like a gloves off, totally bloody,
Yeah.
freaky comic, you know?
Hmm.
Maybe some do. But I have, I've noticed a bunch, I've been around long enough to see kind of zeitgeists come and go in comics, but that makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
And I don't think that it's appropriate for me as an older person or any older person to lament the past and act like it's never, oh, it was so great back then and now what do you have? Like that's not what I'm saying at all.
Hmm.
That's a bullshit point of view and always will be. But but just to say like I have a lot of empathy
Hmm.
for anybody younger than me who does not have access to a life that they could just fuck around and fuck up in. Like you can't fuck up when your rent is $2,000 a month.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm glad to hear that, and of course, artistic influence and decision making and agency continues always.
Yeah. All right. So I guess our next question then would be, is there anything you definitely don't miss about that time?
Let me count the ways. I don't miss how much more sexist comics was back then,
Mhm.
how much unexamined just white male centering there was back then.
Yeah.
I I didn't go back to SPX for 20 years. So I went in 2002 and then I didn't come back till 2022. And when I came back, it had been transformed into a queer-centric, very, very gender inclusive, very also female and all other genders festival. It was like amazing. And all the work was amazing. And the feeling of inclusion was just unbeatable. So I don't miss what it was like in the past. I don't miss sitting at a table and having some guy play pocket pool while he pretends to look at my comics. I don't miss being ignored by male editors and cartoonists at those events. I don't miss being condescended to and called baby.
Mm-hmm.
I don't miss creepy older cartoonists sharking on me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't miss my stories and other women and marginalized people's stories being dismissed and not published and being told that they can't possibly be true or accurate or interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Apologies for the background noise.
oh, it's okay. I couldn't really hear it. Where are you?
Well, I'm at my house, but our neighbors have decided to mow their lawns at this time.
Oh, I can't hear it.
Okay.
There's just a lot I don't miss. I also don't miss comics being considered such a gutter art form that you can't even mention them in articles. And also, following on that, I don't miss comics being so trendy in art world circles that it recreates another kind of gatekeeping, which I think was happening about a decade ago, but I don't really see it now. And that could just be also because I'm just out here doing my own thing now. I don't know, but yeah. And I mean, anyone who misses being 25 is nuts. It's like, you couldn't pay me to be younger
Yeah.
again. Like, that was so hard psychologically, emotionally, physically, financially.
Yeah. All right. Can you give us one more memory or anecdote from that time?
I want a good one that's not going to embarrass anyone. I have some funny ones that might just, the people involved might not appreciate it, even though I would tell them with affection. Let's see, I told you the Kaz Lisa Suckdog one. I just find that endlessly amusing. I'm sorry, I'm going blank. A story or an anecdote?
Yeah.
I was on a panel with Gilbert Hernandez at Brooklyn Book Festival in 2012, and I sat down next to him before the panel started, and I said, I just want you to know that you're one of the biggest influences on the book that I'm here to talk about today. And he looked at me and he said, oh God, I hope you're not broke because of me.
That's good.
And then later, I was just kind of waiting for my friend off to the side, and Jaime Hernandez was standing there, and I knew it was him, but I was just like, I'm not usually starstruck at all because I grew up in Manhattan, and the deal in Manhattan is that if you see a famous person, you pretend you don't see them. But I cannot keep my cool around Jaime Hernandez because I idolize his artwork so much. It's like the most important comics to me are the Hernandez brothers. Finally, he walked over and he stuck out his hand and he said, hi, I'm Jaime. I had just been on a panel with his brother. And I said, I know who you are. I'm just too shy to say hello. But I'm not usually like that.
Yeah.
I guess the other thing I would say is I took a writing workshop with Linda Barry, a week-long workshop in 2001 at the Omega Institute. And it completely transformed the way that I teach. Like, it basically taught me how to teach. Even though I didn't start teaching comics for maybe a decade after that, it had a lasting influence on how I teach comics. It was a huge deal.
Yeah. That's cool. Was it the instructor that had a big influence or the content?
It was Linda Barry.
Oh, yeah.
It was her whole methodology. It was the exercises she gave us. It was her her demeanor towards students, her attitude. It was the atmosphere of just raucous, wild inclusion and generosity that she created in the room, where whenever anybody read what they had written, everybody listened with such intense focus, and everybody would just, people were encouraged to just go really deep and tell the most amazing stories. It was a wild week. I still think about it. It doesn't feel like it was 23 years ago.
Yeah. All right. Well, our last question then would be, can you tell us 3 people we should contact for these archives?
Yeah. Jordan Crane, John Porcellino, if you haven't already.
I actually just interviewed him this past week.
Okay, so let me think of 2 other people. Megan Kelso. Oh my God, who was I just hanging out with the other night that we were telling about this? Lauren Weinstein, if you haven't contacted her already.
Nice.
But also I'm thinking, like, you should talk to some people who are older than us too. Have you spoken to Gary Panter or any of that crew?
I've reached out to Gary Panter.
Because Gary is definitely one of those people. I mean, Mimi Pond. The people who are kind of in the original raw. I mean, Bob Sikoriak. You should absolutely, if you have not talked to Bob, you got to talk to Bob. Kaz, the New York people, Sam Henderson. People who are kind of in either or both the raw comics world, or the era of New York press when they were running a lot of comics, really should be spoken with. And some of those are the same people, you know. Michael Kupperman would be another one. I gave you way more than 3.
No, this is good.
You got to talk to Sam. You got to talk to Bob. You should definitely talk to Kaz. You should talk to Gary. You should talk to all these people. You should talk to Mimi. You should talk to Linda Berry.
Awesome.
Hell, you should talk to the fucking Hernandez brothers, man. You got to talk to them because they've been making comics since 1980.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this. This was so great.
Thank you. This was lovely.
Yeah. So that'll wrap up our episode. Thank you to everyone for listening. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. This has been a production of the Sequential Artists Workshop, or SAW. You can find us on social media at Comics Workshop and online at sawcomics.org. You can hear about our many courses at learn.sawcomics.org. SAW is a nonprofit and supported by people like you. Learn how to make a tax-deductible donation at the donate page of sawcomics.org. You can join our free community of comics explorers at members.sawcomics.org. Thanks so much for being here.